Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for a virtual walking tour of the Cooper Union neighborhood. We've got a great audience of Cooper students and alumni here tonight, plus our wonderful tour guide, Jack Eichenbaum. It's an honor to have him here with us. A few things before we get started. This program will be recorded and all attendees will be muted, you may notice. But at the end of the presentation, we will have time for a Q&A session. So please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions throughout the tour. I'm now pleased to be able to introduce Jack Eichenbaum, a Cooper alum from the class of 1963. Jack was a chemical engineering major while at Cooper, and he later went on to earn his Ph.D. in urban geography. Jack is also New York City's Queens Borough historian, and he's offered walking tours all over the city for many years. Very pleased to have him with us tonight. I'll now turn it over to Jack to begin our tour, and hope you all enjoy. Jack, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I owe so much to Cooper Union, and giving you a walking tour is only a tiny bit of a way to repay Cooper Union for the education that I got. Now, the education that I got from Cooper Union was not just because we had wonderful teachers, and in the engineering school, we learned how to solve problems. But located in the neighborhood which we're about to walk in was also an educational experience. In the time that I was at Cooper Union from 1959 to 1963, there was a transition in the neighborhood around Cooper Union. It went from the upper Lower East Side to the East Village. And what was happening in that neighborhood was so educational in itself. And I, unlike most students at Cooper Union, ventured out from not just the engineering school, but I had friends in the art school and the architecture school, and I learned from all of them. So I had an unparalleled education from other students, from the neighborhood, as well as from the wonderful teachers that I had in the engineering school who were more interested in teaching than writing papers that nobody read. The years that I was at Cooper Union were very important to me. I was only 16 and a half, and I was a pretty naive kid, and I knew about some things in Manhattan. I knew Midtown and Uptown, and I don't think I had ever explored the area around Cooper Union. It was a completely different place than you'll see it today. It was a very depressed neighborhood. Most of what you will see, if you walk on 3rd Avenue right now, you'll probably see a lot of new buildings and a lot of relatively expensive apartments. In those days, things were run down, and what you would see on 3rd Avenue were mostly missions to help poor homeless men and alcoholics, and pawn shops. And I remember I bought a slide rule. We used to use slide rules in those days before we had calculators. And I bought my slide rule at a pawn shop. I think it's the only thing I ever bought at a pawn shop. So Cooper Union was a very different place in 1959. That's when I was 16 and a half years old, which is now 61 years ago. It's just amazing. I've been through all of that, and most of the people listening to this tour and watching this tour are probably were born after that date, and you've seen a very different space than I have. But I've been back often, and I've seen the changes. Anyway, that's an introduction to myself in this space, and now let's start our walk virtually. Let's look at our first slide.
All right, we're going to the first slide, but Jack, I just have a request from the audience. If you could speak a little bit louder and perhaps bring yourself a little bit closer to your microphone in case we're getting some feedback.
This is a map of the vicinity that we're in. You can see Cooper Union, the site of the foundation building, the big brownstone building, right there, almost just above the center of the map. And you can see the Bowery, which is the main street. And it's at this point, Cooper Square is formed where the Bowery splits into two streets, 4th Avenue on the left and 3rd Avenue on the right. And this is a very important place because it's where the colonial street pattern, where the Bowery is one of the most important streets of New York, splits into the new grid pattern, which was established in 1811. So before 1811, 4th Avenue and 3rd Avenue didn't exist. The Bowery existed, and the Bowery was the way you went uptown, and the Bowery continued along this stretch of 4th Avenue. But by the time the grid is established in 1811, the Bowery ends here at 5th Street and splits into 3rd and 4th Avenue. And you'll notice that we have streets perpendicular to the Bowery, or in a slight diagonal, and those are the streets that were laid out in the East Village as the start of the grid pattern. On the east side of Manhattan, the grid goes all the way down to Houston Street. But on the west side of 5th Avenue, the Greenwich Village already existed in colonial times, and the grid doesn't really get fully established until you get above 14th Street. But here at Cooper Union is that point where the colonial grid, the colonial street pattern gives way to the grid street pattern. And you can see that we're right at that point. And when you're standing in Cooper Square and you stand in front of the statue of Peter Cooper and you look to the south, you'll see that square. Now, if you're from outside of New York, you may think that a square is something that's rectangular. In New York, it doesn't mean that. In New York, squares are sometimes squares that are rectangular, but more often they are triangular, where two streets meet in a triangle, like in that previous map that I showed you, where the Bowery sort of meets in a triangle and comes out as 3rd and 4th Avenue. And those are triangles, and Cooper Square is made up of triangles rather than rectangles. Anyway, looking over those rectangles is Peter Cooper, who is the founder of our school, and Peter Cooper is known for many things. Most of all, he was a wealthy man who made his money in the glue business, and he had his glue factory on Newtown Creek, which is the waterway between Brooklyn and Queens. And there's another philanthropist who had a business on Newtown Creek, and it founded a school similar to Cooper Union, and that's Pratt University. And Pratt had an oil refinery on Newtown Creek, and both Cooper Union, founded by Peter Cooper, and Charles Pratt, founding Pratt University, both had businesses on Newtown Creek. Anyway, with the money that Peter Cooper made from his glue factory, he did some amazing philanthropic things, most of all building the Cooper Union Foundation building. Next slide. And there it is. And if you haven't been in that building yet, it's an amazing building. This building is built in 1959 and opens its doors to students in that year. There are art students, there are architectural students, and then there are engineering students. In those days, the art students did not get a degree. They had a 3-year program. It was not a degree-granted program, but the architects and the engineers did, and they all had their classes in Cooper Union. I was one of the last classes to have engineering classes in this foundation building, because I started in 1959, but in 1960, in the year 1960, there was a new engineering building, and I'll talk more about that because that's gone now because we have a new engineering building. Anyway, I did have some classes in the foundation building in the first year I was at Cooper Union, and it's a remarkable building. Peter Cooper was not an architect, but he had a sense of vision, and he knew that even though elevators hadn't been invented in 1959, they would come. And for years, he left a circular hole in the building so that an elevator could be built when elevators were finally invented, and they were invented in the last several decades of the 19th century. But the building was built in 1959. So one of the ways that he left room for an elevator was to leave a circular hole. But no, when elevators were invented, they weren't circular. So for many years, Cooper Union had a square elevator in a round hole. And it wasn't until recent years that a custom elevator was built that was circular and fits into the round hole that Peter Cooper left in that building. Right, next slide, please. The Bowery was the main street, and the Bowery began near the southern tip of Manhattan, and the Bowery in the late part of the 18th century, of the 19th century, became an important route uptown and also became the route of an elevated train, the 3rd Avenue L. In the 19th century, there was a 3rd Avenue L, a 2nd Avenue L, a 6th Avenue L, and a 9th Avenue L. The 3rd Avenue L was the one that lasted the longest. It opened in 1878 and wasn't torn down until 1955. I was 12 years old when it was torn down, and it was 4 years later that I was to go to Cooper Union. So it was only 4 years after the 3rd Avenue L was torn down that I went there. But because the elevated train, if you were riding on a train, it was wonderful. When I was a kid, I thought, this is better than any ride in Coney Island. This is better than any ride in an amusement park. But if you were under that L, all you had was shadow and noise and dirt. So that created, in the beginning, it created a way uptown, and the Bowery was home to a lot of amusements. But by the middle of the 20th century, it had become one of the worst streets in New York. And what lined that street under that L were Christian missions to house the homeless and to help alcoholics and pawn shops. It was a pretty desultory street, and you really didn't want to take a walk on 3rd Avenue, even though the elevated train had come down. But it was only after the elevated train came down, many years later, several decades later, that 3rd Avenue began to gentrify again. Okay, next slide. We walk up a half a block. We left you at 7th Street and Cooper Square, and we're walking up to St. Mark's Place, which is in a sense equivalent to East 8th Street. This is the entrance to St. Mark's Place. We're looking east. Looking east, the east direction is on the left side of the photograph on the right, and it's also on the right side of the photograph to the left. Now, remember I told you that when I was at Cooper Union, this 3rd Avenue, which is where we are right now, before the entrance to St. Mark's Place, was lined with Christian missions and pawn shops. Well, right on the corner here of St. Mark's Place and of 3rd Avenue, right in this corner on the right, there was a mission, and there was a big sign in the form of a cross that said, Jesus saves. And it was Jesus going across and AVS under the S of Jesus that said, Jesus saves. But in my Jewish naivete, I thought it said Jesus Avenue. Anyway, St. Mark's Place is a critically important location because we're talking about East 8th Street, but East 8th Street has changes its name at 3rd Avenue for several blocks, and it's called St. Mark's Place. And it is a more elegant street in what we now call the East Village. The sidewalks were wider, the buildings were a tad better, it was tree-lined, there was a lot more decoration on the building. I mean, this wasn't the place where rich people live, but these buildings were built better than most of the buildings. This was really the entrance to the in the 60s, this became the entrance to the East Village. One very important building along this entrance, let me get the numbers right, you can come and see that. If we look at the entrance, if we look at numbers 19 and 25, which are just beyond what you see here, walk further down on St. Mark's Place to the east, and look at buildings 19 through 25. When I was there, it was the Polish National Home, and it was called the Dom, D-O-M, which is home in Polish. Now, in 1964, it changed. The Polish National Home was bought up by some investors, and to capture the spirit of the times, which is the change in culture that the East Village brought, they opened one of the first really big discos. It was called the Electric Circus. And the manager of the Electric Circus was Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol did not live in the East Village, but he certainly had a spot in the East Village in managing this new enterprise. There were a lot of bands that got their start, a lot of as discos and also as live performances, and it was probably the wildest place in the East Village. I continue to visit Cooper Union on my visits back to New York, even though in 1963 I was already leaving New York for further education elsewhere, and I noticed the Electric Circus. I mean, the changes were enormous, and if you're a student at Cooper Union or an alumnus of Cooper Union, you walk down this street and you see what a lively street it is. All kinds of places to have food, all kinds of places to sit in a chair outside and have a drink. It's a very, very lively street. It's the first block of St. Mark's Place. It's the gateway to the East Village. Okay, next slide. Now we're walking one block further up 3rd Avenue, and we come to Stuyvesant Street. And we come to another sort of square, but once again, it's a triangle, because Stuyvesant Street on the north is one of the very few true east-west streets. It was laid out before the grid plan. It was laid out by the great-grandson of Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last governor of New Amsterdam and inherited much of the property that Peter Stuyvesant owned. And this street is a true east-west street, very few of them, because if you look at a map of Manhattan, Manhattan tilts at about a 23 angle to true north. We like to say the avenues in Manhattan run true north, but they really don't. Everything's tilted at 23 degrees. But one of the very few true east-west streets is Stuyvesant Street. This is 9th Street over here, and the two of them meet in a triangle. And here is a compass rose showing you where true north is, and this is true east, and that follows the run of Stuyvesant Street. So when you're at Cooper Union, this used to be ignored, but this has been replaced by a little square, nicely landscaped, and you can take a look and see how Stuyvesant Street, pre-existing before the grid pattern, got as a true east-west street, still exists in terms of this little triangle. We will continue down, going east on Stuyvesant Street, and look at the next stride. Now what we're looking at are two different views, let's see, of the Hamilton Fish House. Now in this view, we can't see the door on the right side. Can we do something about that? Right now, the door is behind. I can, yeah. I've just moved all of my pictures. If you see the big green door on the left side, you can see the green door up smaller on the right side, and that's two different views of the same building. And that is the Hamilton Fish House, built early in the 19th century, which celebrated an early marriage between two distinguished families. This was probably the best street in what we now call the East Village. In those days, most of what was built east of Third Avenue wasn't very nice. This street had some very fine houses, and this house has been bought by Cooper Union as a residence for its president, who is now Laura Sparks, a lady who I've met and I quite admire, and it's also used for special functions. Okay, so we continue on Stuyvesant Street, going east, and we get to 2nd Avenue, and we come to the church called St. Mark's on the Bowery. And this church also comes with a graveyard where Peter Stuyvesant himself is buried. This church dates from sometime in the 19th century. Two different views. One shows the larger terrace, a large seating area, and the other one shows the full steeple of St. Mark's in the Bowery. And this church is at the end of Stuyvesant Street at 10th Avenue, where Stuyvesant Street hits 2nd Avenue. And across the street from that is the next slide. And this was the site at 2nd Avenue and 10th Street of the 2nd Avenue Deli, which was one of the famous eateries that you could go to. It's after my time, but it also has left us now, and it's a good 10 or 13 years since the 2nd Avenue Deli. It was a kosher deli, but one thing that the owner did, the owner of that deli did, he wanted to pay homage to the Yiddish theater. And the Yiddish theater at the turn of the 20th century, in 1900, 1910, 1920, was the Jewish Broadway. And that's where the famous stars of the Yiddish theater got their start and performed in plays. And there are stars in the sidewalk, something like the ones you'll see on Hollywood Boulevard, memorializing stars of the Yiddish theater. They're still there. Well, they're getting old and smushy and hard to see. But these are the stars of the Yiddish theater. And if you walk on the east side of 2nd Avenue, beginning around 10th Street, you'll see these stars in the sidewalk. And we can continue walking south on 2nd Avenue. And we get to the other inhabitants of 2nd Avenue. It wasn't just Jewish people, but it was also, but most of the Jews who came to settle in that area came from Russia, Poland, and the Ukraine. But the Ukrainians and the Poles also came there too. So this is a restaurant that postdates the time I was at Cooper Union, but it's a Polish restaurant that's very popular. It's got a lot of outdoor cafes right now, a lot of outdoor seating. It's called Weselka. It's a traditional Polish restaurant, a good place to sit and have a drink and have Polish food. It's at 144 2nd Avenue. And if we walk down a couple of more doors further south, we come to, next slide. Just further down is a Ukrainian restaurant that's also home to the Ukrainian National Home, which is a Ukrainian club. Ukrainian food is a little bit like Jewish food and a little bit like Polish food. And this place is a very, very interesting place and a good, inexpensive place to have a Ukrainian meal. And both of these restaurants are still around. I think the Ukrainian restaurant would be difficult to eat at because I don't see that they have anything set up outside. And they used to only have anything on the inside. The Weselka you can eat outside, but this one would be more difficult. So this is a strip along 2nd Avenue going from 10th Street, where we started and we saw those footprints in the sidewalk, the stars in the sidewalk, and we eventually come down to 7th Street. we're going to take a right turn on 7th Street. And once we take that right turn on 7th Street, we come to several institutions that are really important. One of them is McSorley's Old Ale House. And when I was at Cooper Union, at least in the engineering school, McSorley's Old Ale House had a tradition. On the last day before Christmas vacation, all classes in the engineering school were held in McSorley's Old Ale House. When I started at Cooper Union, I was not even 17 years old. I didn't hit my 17th birthday until February of my freshman year. It didn't matter. Drinking age was 18, not 21 as it is now, but even then they didn't check your ID on McSorley's Day. Everybody could drink on McSorley's Day. I suppose if you grew up and brought in a 4-year-old kid, you could have them sip beer from your glass. So McSorley's claims to be the oldest bar established in 1854. And it is the oldest bar in Manhattan. Of course, there were older ones, but this is the oldest one that still lasts. But there is an older one that is established in the 1820s in Queens, and it's called Neir's Tavern, N-E-I-R-S. So McSorley's is the oldest bar in Manhattan, but not the oldest bar in New York City. McSorley's makes their own ale, and you can buy a dark or a light, and sit with other people. They don't have much to eat, but you can get cheese plates and whatever. And when I was still able to do tours with alumni in person, we would always end at McSorley's Old Ale House because it was a great place to have a drink and memoirs. And it's a wonderful place. I can't wait for it to open again. And you should be able to check it out inside when it does open again. It's a place full of photographs, full of the way that the neighborhood used to look like. As we walk further west on 7th Street, we come to where the next slide is. And this is right across the street from McSorley's Old Ale House. And this is the Ukrainian Catholic Church. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see there's an arced tiled area, and that corresponds to the central arced tiled area in the picture on the left. So you got the picture on the right and the picture on the left, and this is the Ukrainian Catholic Church, mostly restored. In the years I was at Cooper Union, once again from 1959 to 1963, the Ukrainian community in the vicinity was dying. People were moving to the suburbs. The church was still open, but it didn't look like it would last. But later, there was a resuscitation, and the Ukrainian community in the East Village is back in business, and people are going to this church again. Now, before we move on to the next slide, there's a preview of the next slide in the building that you can see, the glass building that's next to the Ukrainian Catholic Church on the left side of this slide. And that building is the new engineering building, and it looks like this. And if you're entering as an engineer, you're into a treat because this building is really architecturally interesting. I went to the first new engineering building, which opened in 1960 during my sophomore year, and it was a 1950s concept of what a building should look like. And in the 50s, there was very little imagination. This building has imagination. It cost plenty and actually didn't help tuition, didn't help the finances of Cooper Union, but it did give Cooper Union a building that was worthy of special architecture. So this building is a special building built for the engineering building with all kinds of special things in it. You've got to wait for it to have classes in this building again. It's a very special place. We're looking right here on where 7th Street comes back into the Bowery. We're almost have made a little circle now. This is the Bowery. If we continued on to the right, we'd be in the place where we could look at the statue of Peter Cooper and look at that. And behind, if we look behind the statue of Peter Cooper, we'd see the foundation building that we started off with. Okay. All right, now we're going to continue across the kitty corner here, and we're back on 8th Street before it becomes St. Mark's Place. We're now on the other side of 3rd Avenue. We're on the west side of 3rd Avenue. We're at 101 Astor Place before it becomes St. Mark's Place. And this building is another school. This is a branch of St. John's University, which is headquartered in Queens. How did that happen? We sold the site that the new, when I say new, I mean it was new during my period of time at Cooper Union, that the first new engineering building was, which was a 6-story building, and we sold to St. John's so that they could expand and have a branch in Manhattan. And this building, which belongs to St. John's University, is right across the street from the back of the foundation building, the brownstone building across the street. And this is Astor Place running right between those two buildings. And now we continue to the Astor Place subway station, which is to the west, 1 block. This is what the Astor Place subway station entrance looks like. This is what this was the first subway line, meaning not an elevated line, but a line of rapid transit built under the street. It was opened in 1904, and one of the stops was Astor Place, pretty much equivalent to 8th Street. And the entrances to this is where the number 6 train runs. And all the entrances to this subway line, which was the first subway line in Manhattan, looked like this. They were all torn down. But there was a teacher, the only female teacher in the engineering school when I was there. She taught mechanical engineering, and we had to take a class with her in mechanical drawing, and this wasn't on a computer because personal computers weren't invented yet. And Mary Blade was her name, and Mary Blade taught a mechanical drawing class, and just about the time that I left Cooper Union, she began a crusade to bring back some of the old entrances to the subway. And this is the only one that was ever brought back, and it's due to Mary Blade and her efforts to bring back a memoir of the time. This is in 1904. This is what all the subway entrances looked like in 1904. Now they're not even covered. You just walk down the stairs. Here we've got one that looks like the original subway entrance looked in 1904. This is the entrance to the Astor Place subway station. And Astor Place is named for John Jacob Astor, who was one of the first really rich people in New York. After him, you can add Vanderbilt and Rockefeller, but Astor is first. Astor made his money in the fur business. And when you go down to the Astor Place subway station, you'll see in the tiles, you'll see sculptures of beavers, because he made his money in the beaver trade. And if you know, there are places on the U.S. map that have the name Astoria. One of them is the name Astoria, which is in the northwest corner of Oregon. That's where he got a lot of his beavers from. Another name, Astoria, is in the northwest corner of Queens, where Astor did not own land, but a friend of Astor's owned land. And since Astor had a famous name, his friend asked him if he could use his name to promote his real estate projects in Queens. So the name Astoria was used for the name of the area in northwestern Queens, and then that neighborhood is called Astoria now. So that's how Astor's name got to be so prominent. So Astor first made his money in the beaver trade, but what did he do with his money? Well, most people who make their money in something or other invest in real estate, and we'll talk more about that later. So we're going to go we're going to look around this area too. The subway station entrance is right here behind the FedEx truck. And there's the we're on the back side of the Cooper Union brownstone, the foundation building. And here's the cube. This cube, this sculpture opened in 1967, and it was a gift of the class of 1965. This sculpture is 20 feet tall, and it turns, but it takes about 3 or 4 people, strong ones, to make that sculpture turn. It has 2 names. It is called the Alamo, which is a name that the sculptor's wife gave it, because it has the strength of an Alamo or a fort. And let's see, that is the name of that was, but Tony Rosenthal, his wife called it the Alamo, but it's also more fondly known as the Cube. It's not the only sculpture that looks like this. Tony Rosenthal made 5 cubes, and unusually enough, I was on the campus of another school that had a cube too, and that was the University of Michigan, where I got my Ph.D. in geography, and there was one of Tony Rosenthal's cube sculptures on the campus of the University of Michigan. So that seemed to have come and followed me. All right, so there's the cube, also known as the Alamo, in this prominent spot right in front of the subway station at Astor Place. Now we're going to travel up 4th Avenue to the north, and we're heading in this direction, and we're heading north on 4th Avenue until we come to Grace Church. And that's on the next slide. Grace Church is a real kind of Gothic gingerbread church, which is between 12th Street and 10th Street and between 4th Avenue and Broadway. And on our next map, you can see the big rectangle. All right, so Grace Church is in this space here. And you know, the grid pattern is not completely developed here. You'll notice that 11th Street is not cut through here. 11th Street does not cut through the property of Grace Church. Grace Church occupies this big kind of parallelogram, and 4th Avenue and Broadway are both taking jogs around Grace Church and are meeting up in Union Square Park, and it's only at that spot does the grid start working properly, and it's only north of 14th Street, 15th Street, 16th Street, that the streets are meeting at right angles to one another. And the same thing is true on the west side. On the east side, the grid is sort of imposed into the East Village, but on the west side, it's not imposed until you get north of Greenwich Village on 14th Street. Okay, now we're going to head back on Broadway and go south. And this is the other subway station that brings you conveniently to Cooper Union. And this street, this subway station is a local stop where you can get the R and the W trains. It's the 8th Street station. And when you get down on the 8th Street station, you'll see one of our rival universities advertising its side. That's the stop that many students who go to NYU use. And NYU is sort of moving all over the East Village. And at this point, I should say some of our neighboring universities. I've just told you about NYU. But if you're familiar in New York, there's another very special school down here, and that's the New School. The New School was a pioneer in new social science in the 20s and 30s, and also was associated with the Parsons School of Design, which is very similar to the art school at Cooper Union. And it was a small school also. It was never free tuition. But our nearest university neighbors are NYU, which is a much bigger university, but we have a much smaller university with a lot of things that are similar to Cooper Union in the New School, which is centered around 12th Street, 13th Street, and 5th Avenue. And they're our nearest university sisters and brothers. Okay, so that's the other subway stop that's convenient for people going to Cooper Union. But if we were to go back to the 20s and the 30s, there was a 2nd Avenue L. So you could have gotten off at 2nd Avenue and St. Mark's Place. There was the 3rd Avenue L, And you could have gotten, and I showed you a picture of that, and you could have gotten off at 3rd Avenue and St. Mark's Place also. You could have gotten off at the the 6th train over on 4th Avenue, or you could walk over to Broadway and get on the BMT, the R&W trains that we're looking at here. So there were 4 ways to get to Cooper Union by rapid transit, but now we've got only 2. So now we'll head back to Lafayette Street. Lafayette Street is a street that runs just to the west of the Bowery, but it's very hard to get from the Bowery to Lafayette Street, because from Bowery to the left street to Lafayette Street, there's like a wall, and then there are about 5 streets, 4 or 5 streets that don't allow you to go from the Bowery into Lafayette Street. Lafayette Street was a much classier street. John Jacob Astor tried to help develop his real estate projects on Lafayette Street. And this is part of one of the projects that he helped start. The formal name was Lagrange Terrace, but it was also known as the Colonnades. This is not the whole building. It was a row of townhouses. Some of them are lost. If you're familiar with off-Broadway theater, you may know about the Blue Man Group. It's one of those plays that's been playing forever, of course not during this pandemic, and that's playing in the townhouse that's most to the left. And now, behind, if we turn our backs, we come to the other really significant building on Lafayette Street, and that is Public Theater. The Public Theater has 3 identities. It was originally built as the Astor Library. One of the charitable deeds that Astor did was build a private public library. You couldn't take books out, but you could study there. And it really wasn't for poor people. It was really for scholarly research. And this building held Astor's private library. The Astor Library, along with similar libraries, the Tilden Library, Tilden was a governor of New York, and the Lenox Library, and Lenox is also the name of a hospital on the Upper East Side. Those two private libraries were merged with the Astor Library to form the New York Public Library, whose main branch is at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. And I think that's open now. And if you're first in New York, that's one of our public treasures. This is a real public library. It is monumental. I call it the People's Palace. It is palatial. It is fabulous. It fronts a public park called Bryant Park, in which a lot of things happen. But one of the forerunners of that public library was the Astor Library, and this was built as the Astor Library. All right. When the Astor Library gets drawn into the New York Public Library, it's bought by another institution, and that's HIAS, H-I-A-S. That's the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And we're talking about the first couple of decades of the 20th century, when immigration from Eastern Europe was particularly strong, particularly of the Jews who were coming from Poland and Russia and the Ukraine. And there was a formal society called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society that took over this building and performed all kinds of social services for the new immigrant Jews. By the time we get to the 60s, we don't have much immigration anymore, much less Jewish immigration. And the building is sold once again, and it's sold to Joseph Kapp and the Public Theater. And the Public Theater has 2 locations, one in Central Park, where the Shakespeare Festival takes place, and the other, a couple of theaters here in this building. So this became the site of the Public Theater. There's nothing really it's public in the sense that you can go in and buy a ticket for one of the plays, but it's not like public that you can go in there anytime. But there are theater venues in there that are sponsored by various organizations, and theater that you can see that tends to be on the avant-garde side. So those are two significant buildings on Lafayette Place, Lafayette Street, and underneath it all is the number 6 subway train, which is just about to come up, and which is just about to come to its stop at the Astor Place stop that I showed you earlier. And now we'll come out of Lafayette and go to our last street, and this did not exist when I was there, but these are sidewalk cafes. This is a modern picture, and these sidewalk cafes are placed at far social distances, but these are big spaces that are now available to sidewalk cafes that didn't exist when I was at Cooper Union, but these are places where people can stop and sit and have a drink and will bring their own snacks, and opened up the square to a lot of cozy people watching. And that's it. That is my tour for you as a virtual walking tour of the Cooper neighborhood. And if there's anything I like doing more than this, it's doing it in person. So thank you so much for coming along with me.
Thank you so much for that, Jack. That was amazing. Just a reminder to everyone that we've got some time for questions. So if you have any burning questions about your time at Cooper or for incoming students, what your time in the neighborhood may hold for you, please put them in the chat and we're happy to answer them.
So do I look at the chat now?
Jerry Garchik about the used bookstores in the area. Jack, is that something that you could expand upon a little?
Yeah, a little bit. Third Avenue had that, and it was from Jerry Garchik, wasn't it? Is that question from Jerry Garchik?
Yes, it is.
And I remember Jerry Garchik. He was a couple of years after me, but we were in the same fraternity. And our fraternity house, by the way, was on St. Mark's Place, 13 St. Mark's Place, just a couple of doors before. Oh, there's all these people. Wonderful. Anyway, Third Avenue had when I was at Cooper Union, Third Avenue had the pawn shops, but Fourth Avenue had the bookshops. And Fourth Avenue never went down as far as Third Avenue. Fourth Avenue didn't have an elevated train to depress it. But Fourth Avenue had the books. There was one really big bookstore that existed on Fourth Avenue for many, many years. What am I thinking of? Somebody help me. What was the name of the bookstore that existed longer than any of the others? It may even still be there. It's bigger than any bookstore except for the one in Portland, Oregon. Anyone help me with a big bookstore that was on 4th Avenue, about maybe 12th Street or something like that?
Could that by any chance be the Strand, Jack?
Yes, yes, the Strand. Thank you. That was on 4th Avenue, but there were others. When I was at Cooper Union, there were more bookstores on 4th Avenue. And like, who reads books anymore? I think the importance of used books has gone way down. Okay, let's have another question.
That's wonderful. We have another question, which is, when did McSorley's start admitting women as customers?
Who start admitting women?
When did McSorley's start admitting women?
I can't understand one of the word. McSorley's. I'm not sure. They certainly didn't admit women in my age. I'm not sure when McSorley started. I would guess it would be sometime in the late 60s or early 70s, because in the 60s, there were, and I lived through the 60s. The 60s were a remarkable decade. And there were 5 movements that all got their start in the 60s. The first one already existed in the 50s, and that was the Civil Rights Movement. The second one was the anti-war movement in the 60s. The third one was the ecology movement in the 60s, all of which really never went to completion. We started wars again, and we taught what ecology was, but we're still making a mess of the planet. And the anti-war movement, well, we stopped Vietnam, but we still are starting one in Afghanistan and Iraq. But in the latter part of the 60s, there were 2 movements that stuck, and that's the gay movement and the women's movement. And they were both very successful in the late 60s. I would say that sometime in the late 60s or the early 70s is my guess, because that's when the women's movement really took hold. Anybody know any better? When women were able to come into
Got some folks in the chat saying 1970.
I would say late 60s or early 70s. That would be my guess. That's just a guess. And I'm going with the politics and the change of the politics and the acceptance of the women's movement.
Gotcha. Well, thank you, Jack. And thank you for everyone for sharing your knowledge and thoughts about that as well. Clearly it's a hot spot, and a hot spot it remains today. Jack, our next question is, where does the name Bowery come from?
It comes from the Dutch word for farm. And it's related to German. If you know what a farmer is in German, it's Bauer. And when I was a kid, I was a Yankee fan, and Hank Bauer, I figured out what his name meant. It meant Bauer. And in Dutch, it's Bauer. It's spelled a little differently with a U stuck in the middle of it. And the Bowery was the way to the farm. And whose farm was it? It was Peter Stuyvesant's farm, who owned pretty much all of the East, what he was given as a grant, pretty much all of the East Village, and that was his farm.
That's great, thank you.
Next.
Our next question is, what happened to the Sagamore?
The Sagamore. I'm in trouble here. Anybody know? Was the Sagamore, what was it?
I'm gonna look in the chat and see if anyone has expanded on that one for us.
We got Benjamin is raising his hand, Benjamin Eisenberg. Maybe Benjamin, can we put Benjamin in? Can we unmute Benjamin?
Absolutely. Benjamin, I'm hunting for you. Oh.
Benjamin was waving. He's on now.
Okay, I used to eat at the Sagamore all the time. They were open 24 hours a day. And I was living on the Lower East Side, just off of 2nd Avenue. And we would go in there and eat sometimes 5 o'clock in the morning, and all the crazy cab drivers would be in there. You know, it was, and you could really get a big meal for 99 cents. You could put all this stuff on your tray. That kept me going.
Ben, what years were you at Cooper?
I was at Cooper from 57 through 61.
Okay, we overlapped by 2 years.
Sure, that's right.
Were you in a fraternity?
Yes, I was in APO, and
yeah, and I was in APO also.
Right, and you probably do it.
But only in my sophomore year. Your name is familiar to me.
And well, I was, but nobody knew my name because I was the guy who was hanging around with Sue Huppert. And we finally got married.
Anyway, the name Sagamore reminded me of something, but I didn't know what it was, but you filled it in.
Yeah. It was a great place.
Yep. One of the places that I used to eat was the Automat. By the time I got my when I reached my senior year at Cooper, I already knew people who had apartments in the East Village, and sometimes I slept over. And when I got up in the morning, I had my breakfast at the Automat, and that was right near the 8th Street subway stop that I showed you on Broadway.
And I used to eat at Rappaport's and Ratner's.
And thank you for bringing that up, because I didn't. I used to eat at Rappaport's and Ratner's, and in the years I was at Cooper Union, the Jewish Lower East Side was still in functioning. There was still some Yiddish theater, but there were two famous dairy restaurants, Rappaport's and Ratner's, which have since gone out of business. I think Ratner's existed for a while down on Delancey Street, but they went out of business there too. But those are, I see some people shaking their heads, they know what I'm talking about. That's where you get some really good blintzes. They were dairy restaurants, and they were both mainstays of Second Avenue, when Second Avenue was much, much Jewish. Thank you, Benjamin. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you for that, and thank you for jumping in to help out with the answer to that. Our next question, Jack, is what replaced the Fillmore East on 6th Street and 2nd Avenue?
Fillmore, 6th Street and 2nd Avenue.
I don't know. It's after my time and before I became kind of involved again. I was out of New York for 13 years. I left New York in 1963 and I didn't come back till 1976. And I think that probably happened in my absence. So there are a lot of things that happened in that period that I wouldn't know. Anybody familiar with that era?
I see that someone said it became a bank.
Oh, that's interesting because
I don't have more details than that to share.
Throughout Lower Manhattan, there are interesting banks that became someplace else, like the Bowery Savings Bank on 14th Street, which became a drugstore. Thank you.
We've got another question asking about Union Square and how has that changed?
Oh, Union Square, I'd say in the era that I was, well, in my junior year, which is when I realized I wasn't going to become an engineer, I started taking up hobbies like playing bridge and playing pool. I used to go to Julian's Pool Parlor, which was on 14th Street, just east of Union Square. And so I became more familiar with the Union Square area, which was pretty darn seedy. But there was also something else that was up there that was totally unseedy, and it was the place where I had my graduation dinner. On the day that I graduated from Cooper Union in May of 1963, I had my graduation at a German restaurant called Ruth's House, which was just east of Union Square, and that was probably the classiest thing that was in that vicinity, because Union Square has gone downhill. Now it's gone way uphill. I mean, that's where all the young people go to shop at Trader Joe's, and they go into Union Square to shop for expensive produce. And all around Union Square, there's off-Broadway theater, and Union Square has breathed into, has a new life again. But when I was in Manhattan in those days, Union Square was pretty seedy. Anybody want to discount me?
I see some excited faces at these reminiscences.
I see mostly people of my generation on my screen. Do we have any of the younger people here? There's one. Ben Greenberg. We had a Ben Eisenberg, and now we got a Ben Greenberg. Are you new at Cooper? We've got Ben Greenberg. No, but you look younger than the other people on the screen. What year are you from? Okay. And it's so good to see you guys.
Jack, your next question is, what was your favorite place to visit around Cooper?
Oh, let's see. That's a good question. Well, there was a series of places that I used to have lunch in. There was a Chinese restaurant. We had a rotation between, there was a Chinese restaurant on 2nd Avenue. It was one of those old Chinese American restaurants, one from column A and one from column B. And the guy who ran the place knew us very, very well, and he always treated us well. And that's where I learned to eat barbecued spare ribs. And I would eat at Ratner's once in a while. And then there was District, was it District? There was the Union Restaurant, District 65. Is that
Yes.
familiar?
Yes,
Club 65?
Club 65.
Okay, and that was a place that I ate at frequently, and the all amount I ate at frequently. And favorite places, I would walk over to Washington Square because that's where the village started as far as I was concerned. I made my ventures into Greenwich Village. And I was gay, and I picked up the gay vibes, although I wouldn't have even said that then, although I picked up the gay vibes of the village in the early 60s. And I walked into the village an awful lot, and I saw what was going on there, and that kind of reinforced my own lifestyle. Okay.
That's great. Thank you. We've got someone asking a question. Does anyone remember the Astor Riviera Diner?
What diner?
The Astor Riviera.
Not me.
Well, maybe we'll have someone in the chat might share a thought about that. Jack, next question. Is the Church of All Nations still around?
That's a good question. First of all, okay, what the Church of All Nations, we used to have to, in my freshman year, we would go down to the Church of All Nations for something. I don't remember what it was. Was it a gym facility or something? Who remembers why we went down to the Church of All Nations?
It was a gym for everybody except.
I see Mr. Platzberger moving his hands. Is music or something? Maybe we can turn Mr. Platzberger on. He's not, we can't hear him. I remember the Church of All Nations. I remember where it was. It was down on Second Avenue and First Street or something like that. And when we went to the Church of All Nations, I used to take the F train home.
All right. The physical ed class by Professor Hollander was split into two sections. Those taking swimming who did not know how to swim were sent to the Church of All Nations.
Uh-huh.
The others continued at the Y.
Yeah, well, we went to the Y on 23rd Street for swimming.
Correct.
But those who didn't. But I also remember going to the Church of All Nations for something else. I don't remember.
Oh, probably.
It was
Jack,
out. So,
Jack, you've done a marvelous job. Thank you very, very, very much.
so Jeff Kerner tells us that it was also a gym.
Yeah.
I thought we used the gym at the 23rd Street Way. Hollander and Thurston were our gym teachers. And that's right. That's one of the reasons we use the Church of All Nations. I guess it was a gym for us. And also a place where the non-swimmers could be while the others went swimming.
Yeah, until 1960, the Church of All Nations was the swimming instruction. And we had our swimming test there.
For people who couldn't swim at all.
And at one point, we also had instruction in scuba diving.
Oh, wow, I don't remember that. That must be after my time.
You know, I graduated in 60, and I think that would have been somewhere in 57 or 8.
That's before I started. I started in 59.
The church wasn't there 3 years ago, and I walked by.
Uh-huh.
I went up for a reunion and was walking back from Russ and Daughters on 2nd Avenue, and I didn't see any signs of any kind of, social activity there in the building or anything that would have been reminiscent of any kind of institutional setting.
Jack, there was a gym there, and the volleyball team practiced there, and the fencing team practiced at the Church of All Nations.
Yeah, we used to play basketball and intramural sports there at the.
Oh, the Cooper Union had a basketball team. They played with other schools.
Yeah, well, I think they stopped playing about 62 or 63, but when I was there in the middle 60s, we used to play fraternity against fraternity and other intramural basketball games on the gym floor at the church.
There were so many things that were unique about Cooper Union that the physical education class that we took, where we went ice skating and horseback riding. I mean,
Right.
that was really special. I don't know anybody else who did that. And there we were all going to a free school, and we had all these advantages that were so special. That most of all, I remember Green Camp. And that's where something I did not talk about, but I should have talked about at the very beginning of this talk, so I'm going to talk about it now. I don't think we've got any of the young people who are here for orientation. But if you are from my generation, we had our orientation at Green Camp out in the country on the 1,000 acres that Cooper Union owned in Northwest New Jersey. And that was really special. I remember Mary Blade ran that program.
Right. The Queen of Green Camp.
And I remember her first question, and this has something to do with what is the real meaning of the word orientation?
Yeah. East. You remember that?
Means knowing which way is east. When you orient yourself, you're going east. The very first question we were asked in our orientation, we were asked which way is north. And I think at least half of the class had absolutely no idea which way was north. But if you'd asked which way was east, you could probably see where the sun came up, and that was where we figured that part out. But we were asked which way is north, and gosh, that was such a special thing. I don't know
and the surveying classes at Green Camp, where you spent 2 weeks there, that was like a vacation.
1 week.
Was it 1 week? Maybe it was 1 week.
1 week.
I see a big rectangle that has many parts. Very parts. Gosh, this is fun. This more.
The history of why Green Camp uses
I didn't see that. It's okay. Are we ready for another question?
Jack, do you know the history of why Green Camp closed down?
Money.
Money, yeah.
I think we sold it to Ringwood. We sold it to Ringwood as an extension. But it was becoming, the whole area was becoming suburbanized. It used to be out in the country, but then it became out in the suburbs. And we got a good price for it. I think it was added to the New Jersey park system, if I'm not mistaken. The school has been in financial difficulty in several occasions, including now. One of the problems was there was the mishandling of the real estate of the land where the Chrysler building sits, which is probably the most important part of our endowment. And then there were cost overruns on the engineering building, which didn't help either. But I am on the group of people that's trying to bring back tuition-free education in Cooper Union, and we're going to do it. Just hope I live that long.
I remember visiting Clint Hollinger shortly after the first engineering building was built, the one that's since been torn down. This was in the early 60s. And I said, why didn't they put a gym in the building? And Hollinger said, they promised me the very next building would have a gym.
The next building turned out to be the new engineering building.
Yeah, that was 40 years later.
But the engineering building, the new engineering building that was built in opened in my sophomore year, I thought that was the most boring building in the world. It was so uninteresting.
A shame for an architecture school.
And and in fact,
I agree with you.
the contract was built by some architect who were in the Cooper Union as well. And it was a cheaper building than the one we have now, I mean, in constant dollars. But the one we have now is a really interesting building. And have any of you been in Rose Hall, which is the auditorium in the new engineering building? It's where they also have programs besides in the Great Hall and Foundation building. And there's some wonderful, wonderful programs in Rose Hall.
Okay, guys.
Last question that we had submitted, unless anyone else has anything else they'd like to ask Jack.
Does anybody have any news about reinstating tuition-free, cost-free tuition? Has anybody heard anything more about that?
Send your check.
The school is still actively working towards that, and we can certainly, when we share the recording of this with everyone, speak to that a bit more. But yes, the board of directors has quite an active plan to get back to being tuition free, and every year we are working towards that.
No, I hope we make it. Thank you.
I don't know if you can hear me, but the thing I best remember about the old new engineering building was the chemical engineering laboratory. It was full of pipes, really mysterious stuff like that. The equipment was so big, and all of the chemicals we worked with was water, steam, air, and maybe a little bit of sand. Looking at the chemical engineering building and the new engineering building, I was surprised that the whole thing would fit on a countertop. Quite a difference.
I was a chemical engineer. I remember our laboratories that we had there. And laboratories were kind of fun. I liked our laboratories.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to Jack. A huge round of applause for this fantastic evening. Thank you all for joining us.
Pleasure to work with you all. I'm so
Rest of your night.
Thanks for
so
coming.
much, Jack.
And one thing I'm going to have Anna do is I'm going to, if you have the list of people that signed up for this, I'm going to have them give them a link to the walking tours that I do. I mean, I can't do them right now, but I hope to do using walking tours live in person next year. Okay, Anna?
Absolutely, we'll share that with everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. It's delightful to see you all. It was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.